Hello and welcome to the Ocean News Podcast, an audio series in which we take a deeper dive into one of the biggest stories from the oceanographic newsroom. I'm Rob Hutchins, editor here at Oceanographic Magazine, and today I'm joined by two members of the research team at the Zoological Society of London and the two authors behind a critical news study that has found shocking levels of microplastic pollution in one of the most remote marine protected areas on the planet. Yes, proving that there really is nothing quite as pervasive as plastic pollution, this study has taken researchers to the Chagos Islands, where worrying levels of microplastics and microfibers from synthetic clothing present a new crisis for the populations of reef manta rays that feed there. To talk us through not only the study, but how these findings could now go on to be used to help galvanise action to stop plastic pollution at the source, I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Savage, a researcher with Zoological Society of London, and Dr. Heather Coldaway, a National Geographic explorer and researcher also with the Zoological Society of London. Hi, Heather. Hi, Jessica. Thanks so much for joining us on the Ocean News Podcast. To kick us off, could you just talk us through the study and your findings?
So we looked at sea surface microplastics in the Chagos archipelago and specifically focusing on reef manta ray feeding areas. The reason for that is that Chagos is home to a resident population of reef manta rays, and the marine protected area is a really large, important marine protected area, but it's very polluted with plastic. So we wanted to understand what that risk was to the reef manta rays potentially ingesting these microplastics. So we found 1.1 particle per meter cubed of water, which might not mean much to you right now, but in context, it's a similar proportion of non-fiber particles to Indonesia, which is actually surprisingly high considering Chagos is so remote and currently uninhabited as well. And we also found more particles than the Maldives, which is a similar geographic location, also home to reef manta rays. So in the context, it was surprisingly high amounts of microplastics that we found. We mainly found black and blue fibers, and then over half of the particles were found to be synthetic, including polyester, nylon, polypropylene. So these are all microfibers that could potentially originate from clothing.
Yeah, which is quite shocking, isn't it? And these are man-made fibers, predominantly from clothing. It's a really shocking study and quite eye-opening as to the pervasiveness, I guess, of microplastics and microfibers, and what this speaks for our current protection measures, I suppose. I think areas are protected. Actually, there's this unseen crisis that's unfolding. What does it tell you, or what does it tell us about where our focus is when we think about protected areas then?
So protected areas are generally created to protect species from things like fishing, maybe tourism and other anthropogenic impacts. But plastic, due to the fact it drifts and you can't really control where it goes, it's not going to respect any boundary, any limits, any country boundary, but also any protected area boundary. And in the Chagos archipelago, we've already shown that 99.9% of the macroplastics, so this was a study focusing on plastic drink bottles, they all come from elsewhere, from outside the archipelago. And it's a bit harder to make that conclusion when you look at microplastics, but one of the interesting findings in our study was that there's currently one inhabited island, and then the rest is uninhabited, but we found more microplastics around the uninhabited atolls, which was again surprising, and that suggests that they come from elsewhere around the Indian Ocean. And the fact that we found mainly black and blue fibers, these have all been shown to be emitted by rivers around the Indian Ocean. So that reinforces the conclusion that we made, that they were all coming from elsewhere. So that does mean that a protected area will not protect species against plastic that comes from elsewhere.
Which is concerning, that the focus might be on the protection, but these things are creeping in regardless, which speaks to actually the bigger infrastructure issues, and how do we start stemming this at the source, and and addressing that bigger crisis, which is a societal crisis more than anything else, right? But actually, before we go into that, could we talk about why this is such an issue for these reef mantas in particular, in regards to how they feed, their filter feeding and their natural behaviors?
Yeah, so they are filter feeders. So that means that they choose areas of high zooplankton abundance and filter the water out of their gill rakers. But that means also that if plastic is present there, they will be ingesting it at the same time. And specifically in the Chagos archipelago, Egmont Atoll has been designated an important shark and ray area on the IUCN. That's a really important aggregation area and feeding area, and that's the atoll that we found the most particles in. So that means that they are feeding in areas of high plastic concentration. And then in terms of the impacts that could have, it's kind of hard to study that in such large species that are a bit elusive. Obviously, the ethics mean that it's really hard to assess in a controlled way what the impacts would be. But as we've already talked about, they're vulnerable to extinction on the IUCN Red List due to fishing pressures, and they have such a slow life history that they don't reproduce fast enough to replenish the population to maintain that from the fishing perspective. And the way plastic can potentially impact that is that in other species, plastic has been shown, or plastic ingestion has been shown to leach toxic chemicals into the animal tissues, and that can impact things like hormonal reproduction impacts, fertility impacts, development of embryos. So this chronic long-term exposure to plastic could actually be impacting their fertility and their population growth. So when you think about the fact that there's already the overfishing pressure and they already have a slow life history, the plastic impacting that could mean that their conservation is essentially impeded in the Chagos archipelago.
And we sometimes forget with plastics, we can think about the plastic itself and whether that's, wrapping itself around a manta ray and entangling it, or whether it might be, we've all seen those horrific pictures of bird stomachs. But what we forget is that in the process of making plastics, they include lots of plasticizers and these toxic chemicals that are coating the plastics. And it's these horrible chemical pollutants that are adding to the problem. So every bit of these fibers is also carrying its own sort of toxic burden that accumulates within the manta ray. And as Jess described, are difficult to study, but where there are studies, they're showing really quite concerning impacts. And we're obviously also seeing how that affects across wildlife, but also human health too.
There's a study that came out in 2024 that showed that there were 16,000 different types of chemicals, and that's plasticizers, but also like different additives, chemicals that help the processing of the plastic. And one of the big aims of the Global Plastics Treaty would be to reduce and standardize the types of chemicals, the quantities of chemicals used, so then we can actually understand whether they're toxic or not.
Yeah, which leads me on to the question about those. How do we start addressing these systemic issues that are to do with our infrastructure, are to do with the way that we're recycling clothing, or actually to go way back to the source, our obsession with overconsumption and buying all this stuff anyway. So there's loads of factors at play. So what can a tool like the Global Plastics Treaty do, or how can it start to address this situation? Because I know that it's quite a nuanced one, and I know that there's been a roller coaster ride that this Global Plastics Treaty has been through. What's your sort of assessment of it as a tool to start making the right change?
Yeah, so in the context of remote islands, the Global Plastic Treaty is really, really important because there's such minimal solutions that we can implement in situ. They could be things like beach cleans, washing machine filters, but they're very much at one end of the spectrum. So it's like the downstream solutions and very much not proactive. So the Global Plastic Treaty would put rules in to implement solutions at the start. So that could be, like we said before, reducing the quantities of chemicals used, of polymers used, making it legally binding that you have to design products that are sustainable, durable, that have a recycling strategy or a reuse strategy, not just that they would end up in the environment. So I've heard the Global Plastics Treaty be described by Professor Richard Thompson as a once in a planet opportunity, and I really think that it really is.
Yeah, I think this study just highlights the importance of having some kind of international agreement because you're taking a place, you head south for the Maldives for a couple of days to, right in the middle of the Indian Ocean, to this near pristine environment, to fully protected, highly protected location. So all of the sort of instruments that we can think about for ocean conservation are in place. And then you look at the pristine waters, and then you actually look at the microplastic load, and you realize that these plastic fibers are coming in from elsewhere, and there's nothing that sort of protection can do about that. So we have to have those instruments in place that think about, consumption. It thinks about how products are designed, that we think about what happens at the end of life, and we start the process right at the beginning before it even gets in the ocean. I mean, a manta ray can't tell the difference between a plankton or a microplastic. There's no way we can think about any device or technology or gadget that's going to remove tiny microplastics from the ocean. So we really have to look at not putting any more in the first place. And that does link to individual behavior, but the priority is really to think how we get countries together to make designers more responsible, to make business more responsible, and to drive change in the industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely, totally agree. And I guess this goes back to what you were talking about your discussion at UNOC. Then, Heather, is how do we get this information to the right people? How do we start helping people make this connection between the consumer choices and the impact that we're seeing this have on not just marine wildlife, but the environment? Microplastics are pretty much ubiquitous now. I think we can all agree that they're just everywhere we look. So how do we start facilitating that connection between people's mindsets and the choices that they make as a consumer and the impact that has on the planet?
There's so many levels to that question, isn't there? Yeah, I mean, I think that for us at ZSL, the science is the foundational piece. Producing this evidence that's published in a peer-reviewed journal gives you that solid science to have those conversations with decision makers. And there's a mix of ways we can do that. The UN Ocean Conferences and the Global Plastic Treaty negotiations, it gives some tangible evidence to support decisions and tough decisions that governments may be looking to make. So, for example, in various countries, a number of European countries, they are looking at mandatory washing machine filters. And this paper gives you some really nice concrete rationale for saying, please do that. That would be a very good thing. And in the same way, if you think about your tumble dryer filter that you take out and it's always, full of fluff, if we did that same process at the washing machine stage, then that's really helpful. Another insight is obviously thinking about how we consume and how we use clothes. And there's lots of narrative around fast fashion and how we can be more sustainable. I think the fact that every wash releases over 7 million fibers starts to think about, but it reduces the number of times you wash your clothes. So if you just keep buying new clothes and washing them versus reusing and keeping clothes for much, much longer, then you're also reducing your plastic input into the environment. And obviously the materials you choose become really, really important. So we always find, because we're obviously all about wildlife conservation, that connecting it with animals that people really care about and think about, like manta rays, which are just, stunningly majestic, beautiful giants of the ocean that are cruising around, just with their mouths open, feeding on plankton, plus plastics now, hopefully is a bit more of a connection and incentive in perhaps the same way that plastic bags and turtles have become connected in people's minds as a way of thinking about changing behavior. And then finally, there is this incentive for, it cannot be solved. The plastics problem is a global problem. It cannot be solved by a single decision by a single individual or a country. There is only one ocean. It's fully connected. And I think what we are looking at in this part of the Central Indian Ocean is really inheriting the microplastics from all of these other countries. So that has to be done at an international treaty level to really get to the root cause of the problem. And it's a complex treaty because it has to look at everything from product design to 16,000 chemicals, to products that people, save lives and make life very efficient, produce huge amounts of waste, affect small islands to big cities. It's a treaty that affects everybody, but of course there's also a lot of industry interest in keeping our disposable plastics way of life going, because that generates lots of money. I saw an article yesterday that just said, we're not buying water in bottles, we're buying a plastic bottle.
Yeah.
It's the packaging where people are making the money. So there's not a huge incentive to change that, and that's something that is crazy in the world that we live in today.
It is crazy. It really is. And it all comes back down to the circular economy and introducing people. I mean, I know from a consumer point of view, the circular economy is such a novel idea, and it's such a foreign idea of reuse and keep it and maintaining sort of products at their highest value state. And I wonder what the tipping point will be where people switch on to this and actually start to make the circular economy a reality. And I was going to ask if you engage in industry discussions in any way to provide the evidence or to help land on solutions.
So I briefly mentioned earlier one of the previous studies we did where we looked at the origins of plastic drink bottles. And these results were shared with a whole range of different stakeholders to do exactly that, help industry make conscious decisions about who they invest in. So ZSL has a sustainable finance team where they've got relationships with sustainable finance organizations who invest in a lot of these big brands. And so we took these results just to say, extended producer responsibility should be a key driver for you investing in these brands. And then we also shared these results with some members of Parliament, the UK negotiating team of the Global Plastics Treaty. So the aim would be to get these results to have as much reach as possible.
Yeah, so that was a lot of detective work that Jeff and I did on beaches with bottles, where you can tell from the barcodes, the labels, if they're still on, the brand, etc. You can work out the brands, where they come from, when they were made, and with some very clever modelling that Jess did, we could work out where the sources and routes and flow of these plastic bottles, and work out which were the most problematic countries and which were the most problematic brands. So that means you can go and talk to a company like Danone and say, for example, which was the main one, that this is actual evidence of how much plastic pollution is ending up in this place from your product, rather than generic statements about there's plastic everywhere and your brand's a problem. We have that unequivocal evidence that that's causing a problem in this place, and a very important place for nesting turtles. And so linking again with the impact of the presence of that plastic on those turtle nesting beaches. But we have also, in the context of circular economy, I think it is easy for scientists to sometimes say, here's a massive problem, and not come out with solutions. And that's why we have tried to link this paper to solutions, but more broadly, we have set up a program that links to the circular economy, collecting waste fishing nets in the Philippines, where ZSL's worked for many years. We work with big industry in the form of Interface, a carpet tile manufacturer, the biggest in the world, and they make with another business, Econil, they make the nets into yarn that makes carpets that then are regenerated at the end of life. So that it goes from a linear into a circular economy. So you're removing waste for the environment and setting up that supply chain. So there's an encouraging number of solutions out there. Obviously, huge amounts of innovation and really positive things happening on everything from how we deal with waste to how we design alternative materials. Seaweed is playing a huge part in that narrative. I think probably the microplastic challenge is one of the ones where it's going to be the most complex one to solve, just because of the inherently small nature of them. And another piece of research we did, which Jess referred to, showed that 1 to 3 billion microplastics a day are entering the Bay of Bengal from the Ganges River, mainly blue and black, and that's obviously north of where the place that we're looking at. So that's a huge problem to solve.
Yeah.
And just linking that back to the UK as well, in terms of what you were saying earlier about how people can connect their day-to-day behaviors to these issues. And the Indian Ocean might seem far-fetched, and the chances are the particles that get released in the UK won't make all the way around to the Indian Ocean, but similar numbers of fibers get emitted by rivers in the UK. And so there was a study that showed that 500,000 fibers could be coming out of rivers in Plymouth and Bristol, for example. So that shows that the problem is still here, and there's plenty of remote islands in the Atlantic that these particles can be reaching and impacting the biodiversity of. So yeah, another study that I found when I was thinking about this chat that we were going to have is that there's 5 species of sharks around the UK that have been found to have fibers in their stomachs. So it just confirms that they do ingest these fibers.
Yeah. Yeah, and obviously we know sharks are the signal species for the healthy sort of marine ecosystem,
Yeah.
and what it's all traveling down the food chain, and eventually these microplastics are going to end up on our plate at some point, right?
Well, we know they already are.
Exactly.
So they well documented in the UK, and mussels, oysters, any filter feeder is basically that would typically be taking food out of the ocean is now taking a soup of plastics and their normal food. And the challenge is they're using the same amount of energy to take in that, but they don't get any nutritional value from the plastics, and then it starts getting stuck in the system. So all of these elements are problematic and would just start. So we know they're everywhere. We find them in fish. We find them in every species we're looking at, really. It's really understanding the impact of that is a developing area of science.
Yeah, but there's cause for optimism, as you've sort of alluded to. There are innovators out there pushing the boundaries, pushing the parameters of how we sort of produce things and consume. And I guess the question would be, what gives you optimism in this scenario? Then, what gives you the hope that we can turn it all around?
I guess from what we were saying earlier, this study is another piece of the puzzle to convince policymakers that the Global Plastics Treaty needs to be as strong and legally binding as possible in terms of these products. I think there's a lot people can do as well on the day-to-day, which always drives optimism when you can do something yourself. And in the UK, we're very lucky that we've got a great range of charity shops to move away from fast fashion, for example. There's very simple switches that you can do. Like Heather was saying earlier, putting filters on your washing machines. I know in France that's now compulsory for any new washing machine. So there's a lot of different solutions. So I would say there's still optimism there.
Oh, totally. Well, I mean, I was going to ask you what you hope this study will do now as a catalyst to help drive that change, but I think you've answered that, and very eloquently as well. So I've run out of questions, but I just wanted to say, congratulations on the vital sort of findings and all that detective work that you've been undertaking for the last couple of years?
Yeah.
Years. All such crucial findings, and you just hope that this message has the impact and that change comes. Well, there you go. That was Dr. Jessica Savage and Dr. Heather Calderway, both from the Zoological Society of London, presenting their study on the discovery of shocking levels of microplastics in the Chagos protected marine area. Let's hope that study has the impact needed as we head into the United Nations Oceans Conference next week. If you'd like to learn more about this story or other stories on plastic pollution in the marine space, head to the Oceanographic Newsroom. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Rob Hutchins. Thank you for listening.